Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for joining. Well, what are the opportunities for Governor-Elect Josh Shapiro in a very divided government? And then civility, kindness, and statesmanship, do they really exist? Back after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Well, we have a number of important topics to talk about today on Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And after all, in the wake of the election, we've got to obviously talk about election returns. Joining me to do that is Alex Halper. He's the Vice President for Government Affairs at the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. And David Taylor, he's the President and CEO of the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. All right, David, let me start with you. Josh Shapiro comes in, and as this show airs, there is likely to be recounts to see what party controls the House of Representatives at minimum, right? At a minimum. And then we have, what about his agenda and how does he deal with the legislature, which could be divided between a Democratic-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate?
Well, first of all, congratulations are in order. That Governor-Elect Shapiro won a resounding victory, a margin of 750,000 votes. Those are Bob Casey-type numbers. And so certainly he enters office in a very strong position. But as you say, the legislature is sort of up in the air right now, that the Republicans will continue to control the Pennsylvania State Senate, but that the House is on a razor's edge between the Democrats and Republicans. In the 203-seat chamber, you have to have 102 seats to constitute a majority. And right now, we're at 101 to 100 with 2 seats going to recount. So it's going to be a long couple of weeks. And again, we'll see whether Governor Shapiro, who is undoubtedly, unquestionably a national-level political talent, how he threads the needle on getting his first agenda through a divided legislature.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on some items, the Republicans certainly ought to agree with him. Alex, let's start with the fact that he supports funding of the police. That's a big issue with him. It looks like, as you know, the legislature, the Republican-controlled legislature, and the Democratic governor agreed on a huge increase in education funding, I think $3.7 billion. So there is room for agreement between the governor-elect and the legislature. And as David points out, we fully know what's going to happen in the House of Representatives in terms of control.
Well, Governor-elect Shapiro had this very unique benefit of not having to run in a primary. He was the selected candidate for the Democrats for a long time, so really had the opportunity to focus on themes that enjoyed pretty broad support. And from the business community standpoint, he was saying a lot of things that really resonated with a lot of employers, talking about reducing corporate taxes, talking about government serving more as a partner with businesses, and those are themes that if Governor Shapiro carries those into his administration, I think he's going to find a legislature certainly willing to work with him.
Yeah.
Well, one of the opportunities that I think that Governor Shapiro has is on energy production. Yeah. And that, for 8 years, because Governor Wolf included a request to add new additional taxes on energy production, it has rendered our investment environment uncertain. And so those dollars have gone someplace else. That, if Governor Shapiro would simply say, I think that the tax structure that we have for energy production is fine, and that my administration will not pursue new and additional taxes. I think just saying that right out of the gate and putting forward a budget that doesn't include that request, I think that by itself will give the signal that would actually deliver new private sector investment into Pennsylvania for energy production.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the budget time is always an interesting test for an administration, especially in the first year. Now, in the previous state budget, significant dollars were saved in preparation for perhaps more difficult years ahead. We're already seeing returns into state coffers coming at a pretty decent clip this year. So if those trends continue, it's possible that the governor and the legislature may have a relatively straightforward budget without deficits that previous administrations kind of started off with. So under those circumstances, you could imagine the governor and the legislature perhaps starting off on a decent foot. Of course, it depends on what key agenda items Governor Shapiro is going to emphasize.
Yeah.
One of the other challenges is shakeups in leadership. That with the departure of President Pro Tem Jake Coleman of Center County, with the defeat of Appropriations Chairman Pat Brown from Lehigh County, that we're going to have new leaders in the not just in the upper chamber, but also again with control in doubt in the State House. And again, the fellow who had been the majority appropriations chairman also is not returning. So we're going to need a new cast of characters to run the show.
After the break, I want to return to energy, particularly natural gas, which is obviously extremely important to the economy of the state. Back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, welcome back. We're chatting about a variety of subjects after the general election. We're going to get to some election topics. We're talking about some of the big issues that will confront Governor-Elect Josh Shapiro. Energy. Pennsylvania is a big energy production state. Some progressives say it's time not to end natural gas, but some progressives, Governor Wolf is one, strongly supports the whole idea of continuing natural gas.
Well, the Democrats are divided, and have been for a long time, between the industrial unions and their supporters in the legislature and the Greens who want to literally keep it in the ground. And so this will be one of the challenges that that Governor Shapiro will encounter. But I think people are concerned about inflation. The governor, of course, is going to want to have economic growth on his watch. One of the things that's within our power to do is to increase energy production, whether it's for home heating and cooking, whether it's for electricity generation or for industrial furnaces, for our job creators. That by increasing our own energy production here in Pennsylvania, we can fight inflation by driving prices down, because high energy prices, they cascade through the economy. And so this is something that we can do and should do for our own good.
All right, Alex, let's change subjects a bit and talk about the elections. It's going to be some time before we probably figure out the House, as we mentioned earlier, which party controls the House. It's time for the court, it's time for recount and a whole bunch of other things. What do you think the dynamic is going to be with how that's going to turn out? I mean, any way it turns out, it's going to be razor thin.
That's right, yeah.
Whichever party has the majority.
Yeah, the way things look now, it really could go either way. We know that Republicans will retain majority in the state Senate.
Right.
The state House is razor thin, as you mentioned, and these individual races, possibly as few as 2 races, that will determine whether Republicans keep control or Democrats take control of the state House. Those are razor thin. So it's going to be some time until we know, who's holding that gavel as Speaker of the House.
And of course, Terry, we've seen this before historically when the margins are very, very close down to 1 or 2 members. That's when the intrigue really begins because, if you are in the majority with 102 or 103, then you need to have every person in their seats in the chamber for votes, and God forbid somebody passes away, somebody gets indicted and has to resign. But also we've seen instances where, again, when the margins are so close that people have been induced to switch parties. And so this is going to render the entire situation very volatile.
We also have there'll be over 50 new members of the House of Representatives when they convene in January. 1 out of every 4 House member will be brand new. The House has seen about a 60% turnover of members in the last 3 cycles. There's a lot of new blood in the state House. The Democrats were last in control about 12 years ago, 12, 13 years ago. Very few House members were even around back then for Democrats in control. So there's going to be, if that's the way things go,
enormous.
It's been huge, and there's a steep learning curve to both becoming an elected official, but also transitioning from minority to majority.
I think it's also important to congratulate Lieutenant Governor Fetterman, who is now our U.S. Senator-elect, and to point to the federal races for the U.S. House that going into this election, it was expected that the Republicans would pick up 1 or 2 or perhaps even 3 U.S. House seats in Pennsylvania, and none of that happened.
Yeah, that's right. Some big elections out there for Congress. As you well know, Susan Wild in the 7th, Matt Cartwright in the 8th, and then we have Connor Lamb's seat, the incumbent congressman who ran in the Democratic primary and lost to a guy named Fetterman. Which I think everybody knows, and that seat was run by Democrats. So the red wave did not exist, which most of us thought would occur.
Political scientists are going to be analyzing this election for generations. Such a fascinating confluence of circumstances where the historical trends in many ways were bucked, but for very specific, possibly unique reasons.
All right, thanks for the update. All right, civility, kindness, and statesmanship. We'll chat about those after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
All right, joining me is Jeff Coleman. He's a former Republican member of the House of Representatives and a candidate in the lieutenant gubernatorial primary. He is also the author of a book, Civility, Kindness, and Statesmanship. Well, Jeff, I have to start with the fact, did they ever exist in American politics? Let's start with that, given how tough it is.
Yeah, I think we've always had a standard of a kind of a norm that we've always aspired to. It has not always been present. You're a political historian, and you know how ugly it was. Yeah. Jefferson and Adams and Washington and the Federalists. I mean, it was always there. The difference, though, I think, are the tools that we have to destroy each other, and the number of people who are involved in the brawl. It's kind of like the candidates now are inviting everyone, including our mothers and grandparents, to be involved in a big political food fight. And Thanksgiving is coming up, and it's not going to be a good time around Thanksgiving tables.
Yeah. I mean, also, when you take into effect, in addition, obviously, to the significance of radio and television, you got the social media that directly impacts people in a more personal way. Am I wrong about that?
Well, if you think about it, if you're going to tell people, hey, you have the privilege and opportunity of reaching 2,200 people a day, that's a pretty big, and that's a heady responsibility for people. So people wake up, check their phones, and say, what could I say this morning that would help correct all those kids?
Right.
Or
isn't that the first thing we do is check our phones?
Yeah. Yeah, and what happens is you're looking at your news feed and you're saying, well, what could I do to embarrass or shame or hurt somebody who doesn't believe the position that I hold? So that's how your morning is starting, and that's how we're ending the day, in a constant political fight online.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Gen Z, 18 to 24 or 5-year-olds, and the millennials, 25 to 38-year-olds, are coming along. There are 80 million millennials. They're going to run our government as well as our businesses. What effect is this having on them?
Well, it's interesting. Harvard had a study recently out that showed that by double digits, that group that you just described, it no longer considers politics a serious profession. They respect people of the past. They might say, we liked Reagan, we liked JFK, we liked Abraham Lincoln. But when it actually comes to saying, well, what do you think? Do you think it would matter if you got involved in politics? It doesn't matter. Politics isn't something where if you wanted to make a difference, this is the business you would get in. So cynicism is up.
That's pretty profound when you think about it. If folks say, well, I'm not going to get into politics because I can't make a difference.
Yeah. I mean, politics was always a business that you could point to and say, if you can't join the military, run for borough council, run for the state house, run for state senate. At least you can feel like you make a difference. When this generation is walking away and saying, you know, you adults have ruined it.
Right.
If you can't have a discussion with a neighbor because they have a different political sign than you.
And you scream and shout at each other?
And if you haven't taken your presidential sign down from 2020 and your bumper stickers are still on, there's a problem. So it's not just that it's toxic, it's that adults are behaving like children in many cases in the political room.
All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about your general sense about this election. I'm going to tell you the commercials were never ending, and they were brutal. I mean, if I had to think of one word to use, I'm talking about both sides now. There's no partisanship involved here. We'll get to that in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
All right, I'm talking with Jeff Coleman. He's the principal and founder of Churchill Strategies. All right, let's talk a little bit about this campaign and how negative it was and whether or not these candidates, particularly in the Senate election between John Fetterman and Dr. Oz, who connected and why?
Sure. Well, first, look at the numbers, $314 million for the U.S. Senate race. A record for Pennsylvania, a record nationally. Nobody else is spending that kind of money. And when you talk to a real person in the supermarket, on the street, and say, hey, what do you think of those political ads? There's not a person who said, you know, it was so uplifting, really helped me make up my mind, helped me decide. What you had was people saying, I just hate politics. So every single time an ad aired, somebody was looking at that candidate saying, you're inauthentic, I don't believe anything you say. Whatever claims you're making about the other side don't feel sincere. And you've got the generation we talked about before the break, the millennials and Gen Z. Their highest value is authenticity. All they want to know is that you're a real person. I don't care what you've done wrong in life. I'm glad you're through it. So when you have an example of John Fetterman's health, there are a lot of Republican brethren of mine who said, well, that should do it. If he can't complete a sentence, that should do it. Forgetting that, look, we've had people like Strom Thurmond at 99 serving in the U.S. Senate in a wheelchair, not able to speak. We've had Mark Kirk and others who had disabilities. What people began to see wasn't a question of whether these people were competent. What they were saying is, you know what, can you just be human? Can you just be a doctor? And I began to hear the real Dr. Oz at the end, when he began to talk about bringing people together, bringing balance to Washington. Yeah. If you had just spent $100 million saying what you really thought, the regret of a campaign is when a candidate leaves the field and you never really know the heart of a candidate. That was disappointing.
Do you think he lacked authenticity, Dr. Oz?
I think that when you're going from one profession, TV, medicine, or two professions, into the political profession, you say, well, I'm going to hire the best people. who know about politics, and they'll show me how to win.
Right.
And when you hire those people, they say basically, all of your doctor instincts, all of your human instincts, turn them off and be a politician. So look like a politician, act like a politician. So in that debate, you saw someone who was hurting on the stage. The instinct for Dr. Oz is to go over and hug that guy. There was never a moment like that. It was just hit him, hit him, hit him, hit him.
Right.
And people, I think, began to feel some empathy.
Yeah. Oh, I think you're right. And then the other thing about Fetterman is he had I think, a better ability to communicate
Sure.
with people at a level that most of us, the average person, would relate to.
How many people have a suit like Dr. Oz's versus how many people have a hoodie? Now, there is a
Hoodie and
generation.
baggy shorts
That's
and
it.
tattoos, right?
People are going to church and choosing a church now based on whether or not they feel comfortable. Hey, can I wear jeans to your church, or do I have to dress up? That's the first question people ask when making a decision about where to worship. So I think that was applied in the Senate race in many, many ways.
Yeah. And the other aspect of, so let's go to civility, kindness, and statesmanship.
Yeah.
What has to happen?
Well, I think, first of all, the idea that there have to be ground rules for political debate. Things like a concession are very, very important. When candidates drag out the end of a campaign, like we're seeing across the country, say, I'm going to file a lawsuit, I'm going to lawyer up, it creates this anxiety that never ends. It basically says you're the most important person in the world.
Right.
The second thing, though, is we really have to begin to have conversations with people who are not like us. You have to make a deliberate effort to go outside and find out who your neighbors are before they put a political sign up in a presidential year and you find out, oh my goodness, I didn't realize they were Republicans, or I didn't realize they were a Democrat. When community breaks down and we're not acting human, we become kind of proxies for our political party, and then you're judging people by their bumper stickers. It was never supposed to be the center of our lives. We have to stop the presidential campaign of 2016, which is where it still seems like many of our communities still live.
You make a good point. I mean, it's one thing to have differences of opinion, but that doesn't mean you still can't be kind.
Yeah. Yeah, kindness is something that people, and I make the distinction between kindness and civility, because civility is the rules of debate, hard combat,
Sure.
stark differences. Kindness is just human decency. It is saying, you're more important than me. Let me listen to you. What did you say? We're not listening to each other. Many times you're watching the floor of the House and the Senate in Washington and in Harrisburg and saying, I know who you're playing for. You're playing to your Twitter crowd. You're playing to your Facebook audience.
Yeah.
And you're not actually debating with the person or trying to persuade them.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. You can still have a debate and stick to the issues, but do it with civility and with kindness.
And maybe you'll convince somebody.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's another element to this that's really important. And I hope that someone who spent most of his adult life, in a college career, I would hope and expect that this would be a great learning experience, particularly for the young folks. All right. We'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And as always, you stay well.